out in the high desert of southern New Mexico, on a still November afternoon in 1937. A country doctor sat on a flat sandstone slab and laid a folded saddle blanket across his knees. Before we go any further into this story, if you want a brand new American mystery every single night, subscribe. One tap and a new story is waiting for you every evening. The blanket was wool, grey and brown, sun faded along the edges and worn soft as old paper from 100 long rides. On the underside, where dust did not reach, someone had drawn lines in charcoal and a darker mark that might have been dried blood. The lines made a shape. The shape was a mountain. The doctor's name was Milton Noss. Folks who knew him called him Doc. He was sturdy and stubborn, with a black moustache and a glint in his eye that came from too many years chasing odd hunches. That afternoon he was hunting deer in the Hembrello Basin, a wide bowl of red dirt and pale grass cradled between low ridges in the San Andres Range. The wind moved slow over the basin, like a hand smoothing a tablecloth. In the middle of that bowl stood a hill the locals called Victorio Peak. It rose only about 450 feet above the desert floor, a humped shoulder of broken limestone, the color of weak coffee. Wild grass grew in patches along its sides. Cholla and prickly pear clung to its flanks. From a distance, the peak looked like nothing much, just another lonely hill in a country full of them. Up close, it felt different. The rock seemed to hum, the way rails hum before a train comes. Doc had wandered up onto the peak to get out of a sudden rain shower. He found a flat stone, sat down, and pulled out the old blanket he carried tied behind his saddle. He had bought the blanket years before from a quiet old man near Las Cruces. He had never thought much of it, but on that grey afternoon, with the desert wet and shining all around him, the marks on the underside caught his eye in a new way. The lines matched the slope under his boots. The little dark mark sat right where he was sitting. The story goes that he stood up, walked a few paces north, and his foot punched through a thin shelf of rock. Below him, in a draught of cold air that smelled like wet copper and old bones, there was a hole. Not a shallow hole, a throat, a drop that went down into the heart of the mountain. That is where the legend begins. That is the door no one has been able to close ever since. What waited below, the way Doc told it later, was a stairway. Stone steps cut by human hands, slick with mineral water, leading down into chambers no map had ever marked. He spoke of skeletons tied to wooden posts. He spoke of stacked bars of yellow metal, piled like firewood against the cave walls. He spoke of crucifixes and old Spanish armor and trunks rusted shut. He spoke of letters written in a language he could not read. The trouble is, nobody else ever saw it the same way he did. The trouble is, the hole has been argued over for almost 90 years now. Soldiers have flown over it. Senators have asked quiet questions about it. Treasure hunters have crawled into the rock with picks and shovels and pulled up only dust. The government drew a fence around the whole basin and called it a missile range. The fence is still there. The peak is still there, and the question Doc Noss carried up the hill on that wet afternoon in 1937 is still hanging in the desert air, like smoke that will not lift. Did the cave hold a fortune in Spanish gold? Was it a forgotten storehouse of conquistador plunder, sealed by men who never came home? Was it an Apache hiding place, or a Catholic mission's last secret, or simply the long, beautiful lie of a man with a good imagination and a strange old blanket? Folks who have spent their lives on the puzzle cannot agree on any of it. Tonight you and the desert are going to walk this story together, slow, easy, the way the wind walks the basin. We will follow a doctor and his blanket. We will sit in caves no living person has entered, and by the end, you may understand why the New Mexico sand keeps some of its oldest treasures right where they lie. South central New Mexico is a country of long horizons and short shadows. The land lies flat and pale, the color of bone left in the sun, until it lifts without warning into low brown mountains that look as though they were poured from a clay pitcher. The Hembrelo Basin sits in the middle of all this. It is a bowl of dust and scrub, ringed by the San Andres Mountains on one side and the Caballos on the other, with a single crooked peak rising in its center, like the back of a sleeping animal. That peak is called Victorio. In the 1930s, when our story really begins to stir, the basin looked much as it had for 1,000 years. There were no roads worth the name. There were no fences, except the ones cattlemen strung with their own hands. The land belonged in any practical sense to the wind, the rattlesnake, and the mule deer. A man on horseback could ride for 2 days and never see another rider. The silence out there had weight. It pressed on your ears like deep water. The desert floor was stitched with creosote bush and mesquite, low and grey-green, the leaves small and waxy from holding on to every drop of rain. Yucca rose between them, tall stalks tipped with pale bellflowers in spring. Prickly pears sprawled in flat green plates. In summer, the ground baked white, and the air shimmered above it like a slow river. In winter, the wind came down off the mountains with teeth in it, and the basin filled with a hard, clean cold that made the stars look closer. Victorio Peak itself stands about 450 feet above the basin floor. It is not a grand mountain. It is a hump of limestone and dolomite, weathered into ledges and broken faces, the color of strong tea. Up close, you can see the rock is full of small caves and fissures. Water carved this country millions of years ago, back when an inland sea covered the southwest and laid down the soft stone in patient layers. When the sea drained away, the water kept working underground, slow and steady, dissolving the limestone into hollows and tunnels. The peak is honeycombed. Every old rancher in the basin knew that, even if no one had mapped it. The closest real town was Hot Springs, sitting up to the northwest along the Rio Grande. By 1937, it was a small place of adobe walls and tin roofs and dusty Model A trucks parked outside the feed store. The streets smelled of hot tar and horse and the mineral steam that rose from the bathhouses. Men wore canvas trousers and battered Stetsons gone soft at the brim. Women wore long cotton dresses and kept their hair pinned up against the heat. Electric light had come to the main street, but the bulbs were dim and yellow, and most of the houses along the side roads still glowed at night with kerosene lamps. Out in the basin, life ran older than that. The ranches were small and far apart. A windmill, turning over a stock tank, was the tallest thing for miles. Cowboys carried lever-action rifles in saddle scabbards because the country still held wolves and big cats and sometimes worse. They cooked over mesquite fires that smelled sweet and resinous, like incense in a stone church. They slept in canvas bedrolls under skies so thick with stars it seemed wrong to call it dark. The basin had history pressed into it like a thumbprint into wet clay. The Apache leader Victorio, for whom the peak was eventually named, had fought a battle here in 1880 against the United States Cavalry. You could still find brass cartridge casings in the sand if you knew where to look. Older than that, much older, the Spanish had ridden through these mountains in armor and helmets, looking for silver and souls. Older still, the Mescalero Apache had used the basin as a sacred place, a quiet place, somewhere set apart from ordinary life. They knew the caves were there, They had names for them, names that did not travel easily into English. This is the world the legend lives in. A wide, pale bowl of land, a crooked brown peak at its heart, a sky too big to hold, and a stone shot through with hollows. Heat by day, cold stars by night, and the wind moving always over the creosote, with a sound like a long, indrawn breath. Whatever the desert was hiding, it had been hiding it for a long time. And in 1937, a country doctor was about to come riding through, looking for a stray horse. Long before any country doctor stumbled into a hole in the desert, long before the army drew its fences and the lawyers drew their papers, there were men with mules. They came up from the south, from the silver towns of old Mexico, with leather reins worn soft as butter from 1,000 miles of road. Their names are mostly lost now. The desert took them, the way the desert takes most things, but the stories remember a few. There was a man called Felipe Ortega, a muleteer from Chihuahua, who knew the Camino Real, the way a sailor knows a coastline. He had a face like cracked saddle leather, and hands that smelled forever of tallow and tobacco. He wore a flat-brimmed hat, the color of dust, and a serape woven in deep red stripes that had faded to the color of old wine. Felipe walked beside his league mule, a big grey jenny named Paloma, and he sang to her in a low, broken voice when the trail got long. He carried a small wooden cross around his neck on a piece of rawhide. He kissed it before sunrise every morning, without fail. Behind Felipe walked 20 mules. Each one carried 2 leather panniers, and each pannier was so heavy 2 strong men had to lift it. The mules moved slow, heads low, hooves cutting little half-moons into the pale sand. The bells on their lead ropes made a soft music that drifted out across the basin. If you stood on a hill at evening, the old stories say you could hear that bell music a mile off, like rain falling on a tin roof somewhere far away. The men with Felipe were quiet men. There was Joaquin, a young fellow with a scar across his lip from a knife fight in Parral. There was an old Tarahumara guide they called Pajarito, Little Bird, because he could run 40 miles between sunrise and sunset and not break a sweat. There was a priest too, traveling with them, a thin man in a brown robe whose sandals slapped the stones with a tired rhythm. The priest carried a leather satchel against his chest and would not let anyone else touch it. What was inside the satchel, no one ever said. These men were not soldiers. They were not adventurers in the way the dime novels later painted them. They were workers. They were tired, their backs ached, and their feet bled inside their boots. And they thought about their wives and children sleeping in adobe houses far to the south. They cooked beans over little fires of mesquite wood. They drank coffee thick as tar from clay cups. At night, they sat with their blankets around their shoulders, and they watched the stars wheel overhead, slow and bright, and Felipe would tell stories of saints and miracles, while Paloma sighed in her hobbles nearby. They had a destination. That much the legends agree on. They were carrying the wealth of a mine that lay hidden somewhere in the mountains north of El Paso del Norte, a mine the Spanish crown did not officially know about, a mine worked by hands that did not officially exist. The gold and silver in those panniers was meant to be hidden, not delivered. It was meant to be tucked away in a chamber beneath a peak that only a few men knew how to find. A vault in the rock, a bank with no banker. The priest knew where. So did Felipe. So did Pajarito. The rest of the men knew only the trail. They climbed into the Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man, that long dry stretch of basin where no river runs and no shade falls. The The sun pressed down on them like a flat, hot stone. Paloma's grey hide darkened with sweat. Felipe sang less. The priest prayed more. They moved toward a low ridge of mountains in the distance, blue and patient, a place the Apache called by a name that meant the bones of the earth. That is the last anyone heard of Felipe Ortega and his 20 mules. Some say they reached the peak and unloaded their cargo into a cave the priest had marked years before. Some say the Apache found them first, and the gold went into the ground with the men who carried it. Some say the mules came down the mountain alone, weeks later, panniers empty, bells still ringing softly, and walked all the way back to Chihuahua without a single human guide. That last story is the one the old grandmothers used to tell their children at bedtime, the way a lullaby tells you something true without telling you anything at all. In the autumn of 1937, a man named Milton Ernest Noss lived a quiet life in Hot Springs, New Mexico. Most folks called him Doc. He had a small medical practice, a wife named Ova, who everyone called Babe, and a steady habit of disappearing into the desert on weekends. That was the rhythm of his life, doctoring through the week. Dust on his boots by Sunday morning. Hot Springs in those days was a low, sun-baked town built around mineral pools that smelled faintly of iron. The streets were wide and dusty, lined with adobe shop fronts and the occasional cottonwood gone gold with the season. Cars rolled slow down the main road. Old men sat on benches outside the pharmacy. A radio somewhere always seemed to be playing the same soft tune, drifting out an open window into the warm afternoon air. Doc Noss was not a man of fine clothes or fancy ways. He wore a dented felt hat, a leather vest worn smooth at the pockets, and boots that had walked more miles than most horses. His face was tan and lined like a piece of saddle leather left too long in the sun. People said he had a kind manner with patients, especially the children. He kept peppermint sticks in a glass jar on his desk, but on Friday afternoons, the doctor would lock up his office, climb into a battered truck, and drive south. He would meet Babe, and the two of them would head for the Hembrino Basin, a wide bowl of land tucked between the San Andres Mountains and the long spine of the Caballos. Out there, the world went quiet. The road turned to dirt, then to ruts, then to nothing at all. They hunted for deer, mostly, sometimes for arrowheads, sometimes just for the pleasure of being far from anything that asked them to hurry. Babe was a good shot and a better cook, and she could read the land the way other women read newspapers. She knew where the springs ran sweet and where the rattlers liked to coil. She kept a little camp set up under a wind-bent juniper with a tin coffee pot and a pair of folding chairs. Their camp sat in the shadow of a hill the old maps called Victorio Peak. It was not a grand mountain. From a distance it looked like a sleeping animal, brown and round-shouldered, dusted with creosote and scrubby pine. The slopes were studded with broken rock, the color of rust and cinnamon. In the late light, the whole hill seemed to hum with a soft copper glow, as if it had swallowed the sun and was letting it back out slow. The country around it stretched flat and patient in every direction. Yucca stalks rose like pale spears. Tumbleweeds gathered along old fence lines. Far to the west, the Rio Grande cut its silver thread through the valley. To the east, the white gypsum dunes shimmered like spilled sugar. A man could stand on Victorio Peak and turn in a slow circle and see 100 miles of nothing and feel just fine about it. For Doc, those weekends were the best part of his week. He would crouch beside a fire of mesquite wood and listen to the coals tick. Babe would hand him a tin cup of coffee so strong it could lift a wagon wheel. The stars came out one by one, Then all at once, and the Milky Way poured itself across the sky like a river of cold milk. He had heard stories about the basin, of course. Most folks in that part of New Mexico had. There were tales of Spanish treasure, of lost mines, of caves where the wind made odd sounds. Doc listened to those stories the way a man listens to weather reports. Interesting, not urgent. He was a doctor, not a treasure hunter. He came out here to breathe. That November, the weather was holding warm. The cottonwoods along the dry washes had turned the color of beaten gold. A soft wind moved through the basin all day long, carrying the smell of sage and sun-warmed stone. Doc and Babe set their camp under the same juniper as always. They cooked beans and venison over the fire. They slept in bedrolls on the hard ground and did not mind it. On the morning of November the 7th, Doc shouldered his rifle and started up the slope of Victorio Peak alone. He was hunting deer. He was not looking for anything else. He climbed in the easy, unhurried way of a man who has all day to be wherever he ends up. He did not know it yet, but his ordinary world was about to end. The desert had been keeping a secret for a very long time, and it had decided that morning to let a country doctor stumble into the edge of it. Doc Noss lit a small carbide lamp and let himself down through the hole in the rock. The light was thin and blue at its center, the way carbide always burns, and it threw his shadow long against the limestone wall. He could hear his own breath. He could hear water dripping somewhere far below, slow and patient, like a clock that had been ticking for 1,000 years. The shaft was narrow at first. He had to turn his shoulders sideways and slide. The stone was cool against his back, smooth in some places and rough in others, like the inside of a great throat. Then the walls fell away, and he was standing in open dark. He held the lamp up. The blue flame stretched, steadied, and the cavern opened around him like a held breath. The room was bigger than any room he had ever stood in. The ceiling climbed up out of sight. The floor sloped down in soft waves, the way a beach slopes into water, and the air smelled of old minerals and dry dust, and something else underneath, something faintly metallic, like a penny held under the thumb. He walked forward slowly. His boots crunched on something that was not quite gravel. He bent down and brought the lamp close, and his stomach tightened in a way he could not yet explain. Bones, small bones, finger bones, ribs the color of weak tea. They lay scattered across the floor as if someone had set them down a long time ago and simply walked away. He stepped over them carefully, the way a man steps over sleeping dogs. Then he saw the first skull. It was propped against the wall. The jaw hung loose. The eye sockets were full of dust so fine it looked like flour. A leather strap, brittle as a dead leaf, still ran around the neck bones, and from that strap hung a small dark cross. The cross caught the carbide light and threw it back dull, the way old silver does when it has not been touched in centuries. Doc Noss did not move for a long moment. He counted. He could not help himself. He held the lamp up and walked slow round the edge of the chamber, and he counted what he found, and the number he found was 27. 27 sets of bones. 27 skulls, some upright, some tipped sideways, some lying down as if they had simply gotten tired and laid their heads on the cool stone. They were arranged in a kind of half circle. Their feet pointed inward toward the center of the cavern. Their hands, where hands remained, were folded across their chests, the small bones laced together, neat as church on Sunday. Whoever they had been, someone had cared enough to lay them down right. Some still had bits of cloth on them, coarse wool, the color of dried tobacco. Some wore the remains of boots, the leather curled hard as bark. One wore a helmet. Just one. A round, dark thing, dented at the brim, the kind of helmet you see in old paintings of Spanish soldiers riding into country they did not understand. Doc lifted the lamp higher, past the bodies, deeper in. The chamber kept going. He could see another opening at the far wall, a black mouth that led somewhere else, somewhere lower, somewhere further in, and along the floor between him and that opening, faintly, just at the edge of his small blue light, something gleamed. He could not make it out. Not yet. He only knew the gleam was not stone. He stood very still and listened. The dripping was still there, far away, soft and even. But there was something else now, a low hum. Not a sound exactly, more a feeling in the chest, the way a big bell feels in the air a long time after it has been struck. He should have gone back. Any sensible man would have gone back, climbed up the shaft, sat on the warm rocks under the New Mexico sun, and decided to think about all this later. But Doc Noss was a country doctor with a curious mind, and the gleam at the far end of the chamber pulled at him the way a lantern pulls a moth across a yard. He stepped forward. The bones rustled softly under his boots, dry as autumn leaves. Behind him, the hole he had come through was just a pale grey square hanging in the black, getting smaller with every step. Ahead of him, the dark opened wider. The 27 sleepers kept their silence. Whatever they had been guarding it a very long time, and now a stranger with a small blue flame was walking past them, headed deeper in. Word got around the way word always gets around in small desert towns. Slow at first. A few quiet sentences passed between men leaning on a fence post. A whisper between women shaking out a tablecloth on the back porch. Then, like a creek finding its old bed after a heavy rain, the story spread. Doc Noss had been talking. He couldn't help himself. He'd come back from that mountain with eyes wide as saucers, and folks who saw him said he looked like a man who'd seen the inside of a church for the first time. He'd told his wife. He'd told a friend. The friend told a cousin. The cousin told a barkeep. By the spring of 1938, half of Hot Springs, New Mexico, knew that the old country doctor claimed there were gold bars stacked underground like cordwood. That was the phrase he used, like cordwood, like firewood, split and stacked tight against a cabin wall in October. Some folks said he'd counted 16,000 bars. Others heard 8,000. The number changed depending on who you asked and how many beers had been poured, but the picture stayed the same in every telling. Long, dark bars of yellow metal, rows and rows of them, resting in the dust where conquistadors or worse had set them down centuries before. At the general store in Hot Springs, men gathered around the potbelly stove and chewed it over. Some laughed, some shook their heads, but the older ones, the ones with white in their mustaches and Spanish on their tongues, those men got quiet. They remembered things. They remembered grandfathers who'd spoken of lost mines in the Sierra Oscura. They remembered stories of mule trains that left El Paso del Norte, loaded with ore, and never reached Mexico City. They remembered the name LaRue, and the name Maximilian, and the name Victorio, and they fit those names together like beads on a worn rosary. One old vaquero, sun-creased and slow with his words, said his father had once seen a strange light on the peak at night. A pale glow like moonlight pooled on water. His father had crossed himself and turned the horses around. There were places, the old man said, where a smart cowboy did not ride. At the small adobe church on the edge of town, the priest heard the talk through the confession screen. He said little. He had read enough Spanish history to know that conquistadors had carried saints into these mountains, along with their greed. He had read enough of the Bible to know that gold could be a curse as easily as a blessing. When parishioners asked him what he thought, he only smiled and said, "The desert keeps what the desert wants to keep." In the tavern, down on Main Street, the stories grew bigger by the hour. A miner from Magdalena swore his uncle had found a Spanish helmet in a wash near the Caballos. A widow from Engel said her late husband had ridden into Hembrillo Basin once and come back changed, refusing to speak of what he'd seen. A traveling salesman claimed his father had bought a strange coin off a mescalero man, a coin stamped with a king's face nobody recognized. Each story added a pebble to the pile. None of them made the pile a mountain, but together they hummed like bees in a hollow tree. The Apache families on the nearby reservation heard the talk too, and they listened in the way Apaches have always listened, with patience, with memory. Their elders had walked these basins long before any white doctor stumbled into any hole. They knew the rocks of San Andres by their old names. They knew which canyons sang and which canyons stayed silent. Some of them said Doc Noss had found something real. Others said he had found a doorway he was not meant to open. A few said nothing at all, which in Apache country often means the most. The wind kept blowing across the salt flats. The cottonwoods kept rustling along the Rio Grande. And every evening, when the sun bled itself out behind the Black Range, men and women in Hot Springs and Engel and Tularosa stood on their porches and looked east, toward the peak, toward the place where the doctor said the gold lay stacked. Nobody knew the whole story. The old vaquero held one piece, the priest held another, the widow held a third, the miner a fourth, the Apache elder a fifth. The pieces did not yet fit. They were like shards of a broken pot, scattered across 100 miles of desert. And somewhere underneath all of it, deep in the dark beneath Victorio Peak, the bars waited, or so the people said, or so the people wanted to believe. To understand how Victorio Peak slipped behind a locked gate, you have to walk back through time. Not just to the day the Noss family pitched their tent at the foot of the mountain. Further, past the prospectors, past the wagon ruts, past even the Spanish riders with their iron stirrups and dust-caked saddles. The Hembrillo Basin has been quiet for a very long time. But quiet is not the same as empty. Long before any map called it New Mexico, the land belonged to the Mescalero Apache. They moved through these mountains like water moves through stone, knowing every spring, every shadow, every soft place to sleep. They had names for things the rest of us never learned. The peaks were not just rocks to them. They were old beings, watchful and slow, with stories tucked into their folds like letters in a coat pocket. The Apache spoke of certain caves, the way other people speak of churches, quiet places, holy places, places you did not enter without reason. Some elders, when pressed by curious travelers in later years, would say only that the mountain held something old, older than the Spanish, older than memory. Then they would change the subject, the way a good host steers a guest away from a closed door. The Spanish came in the late 1500s, riding north out of Mexico in search of cities made of gold. They never found those cities, but they did find ore. The Sierra Oscura range, just to the north of Victorio Peak, hides traces of old mine workings that nobody can quite date. Crumbled adits, soot on cave walls, the kind of marks that say men worked here, then left in a hurry and never came back. Spanish colonial records mention lost mines in this country, the way fishermen mention the one that got away. There are letters. There are deeds with vague boundaries. There are rumors of pack trains buried under rockfall. The records are full of holes, but the holes themselves are interesting. Whole years go missing. Whole expeditions vanish from the ledgers. Somebody, somewhere, wanted those stories forgotten. Then came the Apache Wars of the 1800s. Victorio himself, the great mescalero leader, fought a brutal battle in this very basin in 1880. Soldiers and warriors traded fire across the same arroyos where treasure hunters would later dig. The peak still carries his name. The waterholes still remember the horses. When the wars ended, the land settled into a long, dusty sleep. Ranchers grazed cattle, prospectors poked at the hillsides. A few hardy souls built adobe houses that the wind eventually softened back into dirt. The basin became one of those forgotten corners of the American map, too dry for farming, too remote for towns, too quiet for news. That is the land Doc Noss stumbled into in 1937. That is the layered ground his foot broke through. Beneath him lay a story that did not begin with him and would not end with him either. Then the Second War came, the big one, and with it came the United States Army looking for empty ground. In 1942, Washington needed a place to test the new weapons of a new century. Somewhere flat, somewhere far, somewhere nobody would mind losing. The Hembrillo Basin fit the bill like a key in a lock. The government drew a line around hundreds of thousands of acres of southern New Mexico desert and called it the White Sands Proving Ground. Later, it would be called White Sands Missile Range. Either way, the meaning was the same. The public was no longer welcome. The ranchers were told to leave. The prospectors were told to leave. The Noss family, still digging, still hauling, still arguing with each other and with the law, were told to leave too. The fence went up. The signs went up. Soldiers in olive drab began patrolling the roads, and Victorio Peak, with whatever it held inside it, went silent again. Think about the timing for a moment. The mountain had been a secret to the Apache, then a secret to the Spanish, then a secret to one stubborn country doctor, and now, just as the rest of the world was finally starting to listen, the United States government drew a fence around the whole basin and told everyone to forget about it. Some say that was coincidence. The army needed land. The land was empty. End of story. Others say the timing was too clean. They say men in suits had heard the rumors. They say a quiet word passed between officers in Washington, and a map was drawn, and a peak was wrapped inside a military reservation where no civilian could ever ask another question. Either way, the gate closed, and the desert kept its secret a little longer. Doc Noss died on a March evening in 1949, shot dead in the dust outside a trailer near Hatch, New Mexico. He took the map with him. He took the exact count of bars with him. He took the route through the tunnel, the secret turns, the marks on the walls, the careful way he had learned to crawl through that long stone throat without losing his lantern. All of it went into the ground with him, and the desert wind smoothed over the spot like it smooths over everything. But Babe Noss was still alive. She was his widow, a small woman with a steady mouth and eyes the color of creek water. People who knew her said she could outweight a stone. After Doc was buried, Babe sat in her kitchen with a kettle on the stove and made a decision that would shape the rest of her days. She would not let the mountain keep her husband's secret. She would knock on every door in the country until someone opened one for her. She started with the easy doors first: county clerks, land officers, old-timers who had drunk coffee with Doc back in the 30s. She carried a leather folder full of papers, and she wore a plain dress and sensible shoes. And she smiled when smiling helped, and went quiet when quiet helped more. She wrote letters in her careful, slanted hand. She mailed them to senators and to lawyers and to mining men in Denver and El Paso. She kept copies of every one. The first thing she found was that the mountain had changed hands. The army had drawn its fence around Victorio Peak during the war, and the fence had not come down. Hembrillo Basin now sat inside the White Sands missile range, and rockets fell where Mules had once climbed. Babe learned that to set foot on her husband's discovery, she would need permission from men in uniforms who did not return her calls. So she knocked harder. She drove the long road to Las Cruces. She drove to Santa Fe. She sat in waiting rooms with her folder on her knees and watched the clocks. She spoke to colonels and to captains, and when they sent her home, she came back the next month with new papers. She found Doc's old notarized claim from 1939. She found witnesses who had seen the bars. She found the assayer who had tested a sample and pronounced it gold of unusual purity, soft and yellow as butter in winter light. The papers did not move the fence. In the early 1950s, Babe found her way into the office of a man named Captain Leonard Fieg, an Air Force officer who had heard the story and wanted to see for himself. Fieg went into the basin with 3 other airmen on a weekend pass. They came out claiming they had crawled into a chamber and seen stacked bars of gold by flashlight. Then they sealed the entrance behind them with stones, fearing someone else would beat them to the claim. When they tried to return, they could not find the way back in. Babe listened to Fieg's story and felt the old hope rise in her again, then settle, then rise. The mountain seemed to be playing the same trick on everyone. It showed itself once. It never showed itself the same way twice. She kept knocking. She wrote to the Treasury Department. She wrote to the Smithsonian. She wrote to a museum in Mexico City asking about old Spanish records, and she paid out of her own pocket to have replies translated. She sat at her kitchen table at night with the radio low and her glasses sliding down her nose, and she sorted through paper as if the paper itself were a kind of gold. What she found was a pattern of silence. Doors that should have opened stayed shut. Files that should have existed could not be located. Officials who had spoken to her in the spring stopped returning her letters by fall. A geologist who promised to help took a new job out of state. A lawyer who took her case died before the paperwork was filed. Babe came to believe, late in her life, that something had been removed from the mountain without her, not by Apaches, not by Spaniards, by trucks, by men with orders, by the same fence that kept her out. She could not prove it. She could only point at the empty places where proof should have been. She died still knocking. The folder she left behind held 20 years of letters, and most of them had never been answered, and the ones that had been answered said almost nothing at all. Long before the soldiers came, before the doctor fell through the rock, before the widow knocked on senators' doors, there was a priest. His name was Padre Felipe LaRue, and the people who claim to know his story tell it the way you tell a family secret, quiet and slow, with their hands folded in their laps. The version passed down by old families in the Mesilla Valley goes something like this. A man named Padre, who had worked the mountain in his youth, came to LaRue's little mission in the 1790s. Padre was dying. He had nothing to give the church, so he gave the priest the only thing he owned, which was a memory. He told LaRue about a place in the mountains north of El Paso del Norte, a place where the rock ran soft with gold and silver, and where the Spanish had once worked the veins before being driven out. A descendant of one of LaRue's parishioners, an old woman named Maria, told her story to a writer in the 1950s. She spoke in Spanish with her rosary in her hand. She said her great-grandmother had known the Padre as a child. The Padre, she said, was not a greedy man. He took his people north because the crops had failed, and there was hunger in the village. He took them to the mountain Pedro had described. And there, she said, they found what Pedro had promised, soft yellow stone that bent under a hammer, a cave with walls that glowed in the torchlight like the inside of a sunset. Maria said, the Padre made his people swear an oath. They would take only what they needed. They would tell no one. They would seal the entrance with their own hands every time they left, and for many years, she said, they did. Another voice in this story belongs to a Franciscan brother named Tomas, whose letters surfaced briefly in a private collection in Santa Fe. The letters were copies, not originals, and historians argue about whether they are real. In one letter, dated 1798, Brother Tomas wrote about a visit to LaRue's mission. He said the village was small and poor on the outside, but the chapel held silver candlesticks, heavy as stones, and the children wore little crosses of gold around their necks, as if such things were nothing. Brother Tomas wrote that he asked the Padre where the wealth came from. LaRue smiled and said only that God provides for those who keep his secrets. Brother Tomas left the next morning. He never returned. The letters end without conclusion. The story takes its darker turn in the telling of a man named Don Esteban, an old rancher whose family had lived in the basin for 6 generations. He spoke to a New Mexico folklorist in 1962, sitting on the porch of his adobe house while the sun went down over the Caballos. Don Esteban said his great-great-grandfather had been one of the soldiers sent from Mexico City to find Padre LaRue. The Spanish crown had heard whispers. A priest, a mountain, gold, flowing into a village that paid no taxes and asked for no help. The soldiers came. They demanded the Padre tell them where the mine was. He refused. They tortured him, Don Esteban said quietly, the way you'd mention bad weather. They tortured him for 3 days, and on the 3rd day, when he still would not speak, they killed him. They killed every man in the village who knew. They killed them on the steps of the chapel and left them there. Don Esteban said his great-great-grandfather wrote in his journal that the soldiers searched the mountain for a year. They never found a thing. The Padre had sealed the door so well, and the people who knew where it was had died with the secret tucked behind their teeth. The folklorist asked Don Esteban if he believed it. The old man took a long time to answer. He said his grandmother had a small gold cross that came down from those days. He said he had held it as a boy. He said it weighed more than a cross that size should weigh, and the gold inside it was the color of old butter, the color you don't see anymore. Then he said something the folklorist wrote down, word for word. The Padre's mountain is still there, Don Esteban told him. The door is still sealed there, and the people who know where it is are quiet for the same reason the Padre was quiet, because some things are not meant to be carried out into the daylight, where men will only fight over them and lose them again. Step back from the peak for a moment. Walk away from Doc Nos and his widow, away from Padre LaRue and his copper bell, away from the skeletons in the dark. Stand on a high ridge in southern New Mexico and look out at the basin the way a hawk would. From up there, the stories start to rhyme. The Spanish came north from Mexico in heavy iron, looking for cities made of gold. They found dust and thorns, and a sky so blue it hurt the eyes. They also found old workings that were already old when they got there. Shafts cut into red rock, tailings piled like sleeping dogs. Someone had been digging here long before the Conquistadors took a wrong turn into this country. The records they left behind are thin and brown and water-stained, but the records exist. Reports filed in Mexico City speak of mines worked in the Sierra Oscura, mules loaded with ore moving south along old trails, priests writing careful letters about how much silver the church was owed. The names of the mountains change from page to page, but the country stays the same. It is always a basin ringed by sharp peaks. It is always a hot wind and a thin creek and a hill that hides a door. Now hold those Spanish papers in one hand, in the other. Hold the story of Padre LaRue, who came up from old Mexico with a small band of farmers, looking for a mountain a dying soldier had described to him. The soldier said the mountain had a creek that ran a certain way. He said there was gold inside it, soft and easy to take. LaRue walked north with his people and found a place that matched. He made them swear to keep it secret. They worked the gold and hid it in a cave when the soldiers from the south came looking. The Spanish maps and the LaRue story are not the same story, but they happen in the same country. They happen in the same kind of basin. They both talk about gold pulled from a hill and then stacked in a cave when trouble came riding. Set those two beside the Apache memory. The Apache spoke of a mountain that the old people did not climb, a place where the spirits lived in cold rooms made of stone. They did not call it a mine. They called it something older, but the location they pointed to, when they pointed at all, sat in the same dry country as the Spanish workings and the LaRue Hill. 3 stories, 3 peoples, 3 different centuries. They all keep coming back to a stretch of desert no wider than a man's hand on a map. Then, at Doc Nos in 1937, crawling down a hole in Victorio Peak, finding bars stacked like cordwood and skeletons sitting in a circle in the dark. He had not read the Spanish papers. He had not heard the LaRue tale in any careful way. He was a foot doctor with a bum knee and a hunting rifle, and yet the cave he climbed into matched the cave the priest was said to have sealed. The bars he described matched the size and weight of bars the Spanish poured in their crude furnaces. The skeletons matched the story of workers killed to keep a secret. People who study this country for a living have noticed. They lay the old documents on a table next to the Nos photographs. They lay the Apache place names next to a modern survey map. The lines do not quite touch, but they lean toward each other the way iron filings lean toward a magnet under glass. A skeptic will say, of course they rhyme. People who go looking for buried gold in a desert will always describe the same kind of cave. A hot land with hard rock makes only one kind of hiding place. The brain fills in the rest. The Spanish wrote what they hoped to find. LaRue's people told the story their grandchildren wanted to hear. Doc Nos saw what years of campfire talk had already painted on the inside of his skull. A believer will say the rhyme is the point. 3 groups of strangers, separated by language and time, are pointing at the same hill. That is not coincidence. That is a fact. Wearing 3 different coats, both views sit in the basin together, like 2 old men sharing a bench and not speaking. The desert does not take sides. It only keeps the door closed and waits for the next traveler to come along with a saddle blanket and a pencil and a story that sounds, somehow, like one already told. Long before the Spanish came riding through the basin in their iron hats, the Apache knew these mountains the way a child knows the rooms of his own house. They walked the Hembrillo with bare feet on warm stone. They drank from springs that bubbled up cold and clean between the creosote, and they spoke, quietly, of a place inside the mountain that did not belong to the daylight world. The old people called it, in one telling, the place of cold light, not fire, not sun, a different kind of brightness, soft and steady, that lived deep inside the rock. To hear the story from those who remembered it, the cold light came from stones that had been gathered there long ago, stones that were yellow, stones that were white, stones the color of a winter moon resting on still water. The Apache did not call it gold. Gold was a Spanish word, and a Spanish hunger. To the people who lived in the basin, the metal in the mountain was something older than greed. It was a sleeping thing. It belonged to the mountain the way a heart belongs to a body, and when the wind moved through certain canyons at certain hours, the old people said you could hear the mountain breathing around it. The stories did not all agree. Some elders spoke of a single chamber, deep and wide, where the walls were stacked with bars left by men who came before the Spanish, before even the ancient Pueblo builders. Other tellings described a whole network of rooms, each one swallowing the next, with passages so narrow a grown man had to crawl on his belly to pass through. Still others spoke only of a doorway, a simple, square shadow in the rock face that opened in some seasons and closed in others, and could not be found by anyone who came looking for it on purpose. What ran through every version was a warning. The cold light was not for the taking. The mountain did not give, it learned, and only to those who asked the right way, and only ever a little. A handful of dust for a sick child, a small bright stone for a journey across the Llano. Anything more, and the mountain remembered. There were stories of men who forgot the rule. A young hunter who carried out a heavy bag and could not find his camp for 3 nights. A trader who hid pieces in his saddlebag and woke at dawn to find his horse standing over him, still saddled, the bag empty, the trader miles from where he had slept. The Apache told these stories the way people everywhere tell stories about doors that should not be opened. When Victorio led his people through this basin in the late summer of 1880, riding the high country and the low water sources both, the old tellings followed him. White soldiers chased him into the Hembrillo and lost men there in a long, hot fight that nobody won cleanly. After Victorio rode south into Mexico, the basin sat empty again, the wind moving over the spent shell casings and the bones of horses. But the cave talk did not leave. It only sank deeper into the family lines, told quieter, passed in Apache rather than in English, kept among grandmothers and grandfathers, who knew the difference between what to share and what to hold. A handful of those whispers found their way out anyway. In the 1930s, before Doc Noss ever climbed his peak, ranchers in the area reported old Mescalero men pointing toward Victorio and saying only, in broken English, that there were things inside the rock and that white men should leave them where they lay. One cowboy claimed an Apache packer told him a chamber lay beneath the southern face, big enough to hold a herd of cattle, and full of a metal the spirits had laid down to cool the world. The cowboy laughed. The packer did not. Later, when the army came in and put up its fences and its signs, some Apache elders are said to have nodded, almost relieved. The fence kept treasure hunters out. The fence kept the mountain quiet. Whatever lived inside the cold light could go on sleeping undisturbed, behind the wire and the warning signs and the long flat miles of restricted range. Whether the stories described the same chamber that Doc Noss said he crawled into, or a different chamber, or no chamber at all, but only a way of remembering the holiness of high places, nobody outside those families can say with certainty. The whispers do not unlock the mountain. They only suggest gently that someone was listening to it a long time before the rest of us came looking. Every old story has a stone in it that won't move, a detail you can turn over 100 times, looking for the seam, looking for the trick, and no matter how long you study it, the stone stays solid in your hand. The Victorio Peak story has many such stones, but the heaviest one is this. In the spring of 1880, a small cavalry patrol rode into the Hembrillo Basin. They never rode out. Picture the country as it looked that year. The San Andres Range cut the sky like a row of broken teeth, dry and pale under a sun that bleached the rocks white. The basin itself sat low and wide between the peaks, a bowl of sand and creosote and brittle grass. In spring, the Ocotillo wore tiny red flames at the tip of each thorny arm. The wind came down from the saddles smelling of dust and warm stone. There were springs hidden in the folds, small and stubborn, and the Apache knew every one. This was the country of Victorio himself, not the peak, but the man it would later be named for, the Mimbreño chief who led his people through one of the longest-running fights the Southwest ever saw. By April of 1880, he had been moving like smoke through these mountains for months. The 9th Cavalry, the black soldiers the Apache called Buffalo Soldiers, were trying to pin him down. They were good riders and steady men, and the country chewed them up anyway. On the 6th of April, a battle broke out in the basin, real, documented, written down in the dispatches that came after. Soldiers fought for water at a spring, while Apache marksmen held the high ground above them. The fight lasted into the next day. When it was over, the army had paid in blood for a few mouthfuls of muddy water, and Victorio had slipped away into the rocks, like he always did. But, folded inside that known battle, the storytellers say, is a smaller story, a patrol that had been sent ahead to scout a side canyon. 12 men, by the most common telling. A young lieutenant with sandy hair, a sergeant who had ridden these hills for years, mules, carrying water bags and hard biscuit. They moved up a dry wash that climbed toward the shoulder of what would one day be called Victorio Peak, and they did not come back. No bodies were ever found, no bones bleaching in a drawer, no saddles, no canteens, no scattered brass from a last stand. The army searched. The Apache, when asked years later through interpreters, said they had not fought there that day. They had seen the patrol ride in. They had not seen it ride out either, but they swore no arrow of theirs had touched it. The official record, what little of it survives, lists the men as missing in a basin no bigger than a small county, missing in open country, where a single horse leaves tracks for a week, missing as if the ground had simply opened beneath them and closed again years later. When Doc Noss told his wife about the chamber under the peak, she pressed him on what else he had seen down there. He spoke of the skeletons, the bars, the Spanish armor, and then, in one telling, he mentioned something else. Buttons, brass buttons, with the US cavalry mark on them, scattered in the dust of a side passage. A bit of blue wool, gone stiff with age, a belt buckle green from time. He never said how many men, he never said how he knew the year, but he said the buttons were there, in a place no man should have been able to walk into and lie down to die. You can do what you like with that detail. You can call it a tall tale, layered onto a tall tale. You can say Doc Noss was a salesman of dreams, and he knew how to season a story. You can point out that the 1880 dispatches do not list a missing patrol by name, and that regiments lost men in those years and did not always write each one down. Or you can sit with it, a canyon that swallowed 12 riders without a sound, a cave that 57 years later was said to hold their buttons, a mountain that the army would eventually fence off so thoroughly that no civilian could walk its slopes for half a century. The stone sits in your hand. Turn it slowly. The seam does not show. Outside the basin, the wind keeps moving across the creosote, smelling of dust and warm stone, the way it did in the spring of 1880. Not everyone believes the story of Victorio Peak, and the people who don't believe have read more about it than most. They know the dates. They know the names. They've stood at the base of that little brown hill and looked up at it the way a man looks at a magic trick he thinks he's already figured out. The skeptics start with one simple question. Where, they ask, did the gold actually come from? New Mexico had Spanish miners, sure, but the Sierra Oscura was not a major mining district. The big colonial operations sat farther west, in places like Santa Rita and the mountains near Pinos Altos. A hoard the size of what Doc Noss described would mean thousands of bars. Thousands. That much gold would leave a trail in the records. Royal fifths owed to the Spanish crown, shipping manifests, letters from worried priests, and the skeptics will tell you plainly that no such trail exists. Then they bring up the Mormon wagon train in 1879. A small band of Mormon settlers moved through southern New Mexico on their way to colonies in Arizona and Mexico. They left ruts in the soft caliche. They left broken wheel rims and pieces of harness. They left tin cans by their cook fires. And down in the soil around Hembrillo Basin, treasure hunters have, over the years, dug up bits of 19th century junk, square nails, buckle pieces, glass that turned purple in the desert sun. To the skeptic, this is the answer. Old metal in old ground, nothing more. The shiny things people found in the dirt were not Spanish at all. They were Mormon, or Apache, or Cavalry, or some lonely shepherd's lost coin. The mountain, the skeptic says, is a graveyard of small mistakes, not a vault of buried kings. Geologists have their own quiet doubts. They look at the limestone of Victorio Peak and they shrug. Yes, caves form here. Yes, there are voids and cracks and small chambers, but a cave system big enough to hold 1,000 bars and 27 bodies and stacked crates of jewels would be, in geological terms, a very large feature. Large features get noticed. They show up on ground surveys. They register on certain kinds of imaging, and every official survey that has gone under that peak has come back with the same answer. Some passages, some voids, nothing like the cathedral Doc Noss described. The historians chime in next. They point to Doc Noss himself, a foot doctor with a 6th grade education and a fondness for tall talk, a man who, by every account, loved an audience and loved a drink and loved the sound of his own voice telling the same story bigger each time. His widow babe was steady and serious, but Doc, the historians whisper, was the kind of man who could find a nickel in a creek bed and by supper time have it polished into a Roman coin. And the gold bars he showed people, the ones he carried into Santa Fe and El Paso, where did those go? Why was there never a clean, photographed, weighed and assayed bar offered up to a museum or a university? The skeptic looks at all this and says, gently, that the simplest answer is usually the right one. A clever man found something small. He stretched it into something large. The desert did the rest. These are good arguments, honest ones, the kind that any careful person should sit with. But then the skeptic comes to the part that makes them go quiet. Because the United States Army did, in fact, close that range. The fence went up, the signs went out, the land became forbidden, and men in uniform, men with no reason to be there at all, were seen carrying things out of the basin in the years that followed. Soldiers talked quietly, carefully, years later, in the warmth of a kitchen, to a son or a nephew. They said they had seen the inside of a tunnel. They said they had helped load a truck. A man who believes in nothing can shrug off a treasure tale. A man who believes in nothing has a harder time shrugging off the army. Why fence a hill where there is nothing under it? Why guard a door that opens onto an empty room? Why send congressional inquiries, decade after decade, into a story that is supposed to be a foot doctor's lie? The skeptics have answers for these things too. Bureaucratic inertia, misremembered stories, the natural human tendency to grow a legend in dry soil. But their answers get softer here, and the wind blows through Hembrillo Basin, and the little brown peak sits in the sun, keeping its own counsel, saying nothing at all. There's a kind of person you meet if you spend enough time in the small towns ringing the San Andres Mountains, who doesn't argue about Victorio Peak. They don't raise their voice. They don't try to convince you. They just nod when the subject comes up, take a slow sip of coffee, and look out the window at the long brown line of the range. They saw what they saw. The desert can keep its secrets from the rest of the world. It didn't keep them from them. One of those people was a man named Roscoe Parr. He drove a freight truck out of Las Cruces in the late 1940s, and he had a younger cousin who'd worked on Doc Noss's crew during the first dig. Roscoe kept a battered tin cigar box on the top shelf of his pantry, behind the flour and the dried beans. Inside that box was a folded handkerchief, soft as old paper, and inside the handkerchief was about a tablespoon of yellow dust, finer than salt, the color of a candle flame. Roscoe never tried to sell it. He never showed it to strangers. But once in a while, on a quiet Sunday, he'd take the box down and let a grandchild peek inside. He'd tell them his cousin gave it to him in 1939, scooped from a leather pouch the cousin had carried out of the mountain in his coat pocket. Roscoe lived another 40 years. He never changed the story, not one detail. There were others like him. A schoolteacher in Hatch, named Della Bryant, kept a single coin in a velvet ring box. She said her father had been one of the men Doc Noss trusted to help haul bars down the shaft, and the coin was payment, slipped into his palm at the end of a long, hot day. The coin was thick and uneven, stamped with a cross on one side and worn smooth on the other. She let the local priest examine it once. He held it up to the light, turned it slowly, and handed it back without a word. A rancher named Henry Vega, who ran cattle east of the basin, kept a small ingot wrapped in oilcloth in the bottom of his tack trunk. He said he traded a saddle for it in 1952 from a man passing through who needed gasoline money and had nothing else to offer. Henry knew where the ingot came from. The man told him plainly, sitting on the porch with the sun going down. Henry didn't doubt it. He just wrapped the bar in cloth and put it away. And he never spent it, not once, in the 40 years he lived after. These people had something in common beyond the gold. They had calm. They didn't feel the need to prove anything. They'd been touched briefly by something the rest of the world spent lifetimes chasing, and they'd come back to ordinary days with their feet on ordinary ground. The fever passed through them and left them clean. It cost them, of course. Della Bryant lost a brother to the mountain, a man who went looking for more and never came back to town. Roscoe Parr's cousin drank himself sick by the time he was 50, haunted by the dark passages he'd crawled through and the things he claimed to have seen stacked against the cave walls. Henry Vega had men show up at his ranch in the middle of the night, more than once, asking questions he refused to answer. He kept a shotgun by the door and a dog that didn't like strangers. But ask any of them in their last years whether they wished they'd never heard of Victorio Peak, and they'd shake their heads slow. They'd seen proof that the old stories weren't just stories. The Padre's gold was real. The Spanish bars were real. The skeletons in the dark, and the bones of mules, and the candle stubs burned down to nothing by men dead. 300 years, all of it real, and they'd been chosen, in some small accidental way, to carry a piece of that truth out into the daylight. Roscoe died in 1981. His daughter found the cigar box where he'd always kept it. Behind the flower, the handkerchief still folded soft. She left it there. She said it didn't feel right to move it. As far as anyone knows, that little bit of yellow dust is still sitting on a pantry shelf in a quiet house outside Las Cruces, waiting. The believers don't need anyone to believe them back. They've already won the only argument that ever mattered to them. They know what they saw. Step away from the papers and the cigar boxes for a while. Set down the maps and the affidavits. Let the desert speak instead. Because the land around Victorio Peak has its own way of telling the story. It does not need a witness. It does not need a notary. The wind has been writing the record for 400 years, and if you stand quiet long enough, you can almost read it. Start with the peak itself. From a distance, it looks like a tooth pulled from the jaw of a much larger mountain. The stone is the color of old bone, streaked with rust where the iron in the rock has wept down its sides. Around the base, the creosote grows thin and silver, hugging the ground as if it does not want to be seen. The yucca lifts its pale stalks like candles that nobody lit, and the ground, if you walk it, gives back a hollow sound in places you would not expect. Locals will tell you about the trees. There is a kind of mesquite that should grow tall and broad in this country. Near the peak, the mesquites grow crooked. Their trunks twist like wrung cloth, and their roots ride along the surface of the ground, as if something underneath would not let them sink. Old ranchers used to say those trees were trying to crawl away. They had seen too much, the saying went, and they wanted to leave on the only legs they had. Then there is the matter of the soil. More than one prospector, over the long century of digging, tried to put up a shack near the eastern face of the peak. They poured footings. They set posts. They came back in the spring to find their corners shifted and their walls leaning, as if the earth had shrugged in its sleep. One man built 3 times. Each time the ground swallowed a little more of his floor. He finally hauled his lumber off and moved 20 miles east, where the dirt agreed to hold still. The water remembers too. There used to be a thin seep on the southern slope that ran clear in spring. Old maps marked it as a stopping place for cattle. Then, sometime in the 1940s, the seep moved. It did not dry up. It surfaced a half-mile away in a place no map had ever shown a spring. The cows still found it. The cows always find the water. They walked a new path through the brush, leaving a thin grey trail that curved around the peak like a person stepping around a sleeping dog. The animals say plenty if you know how to listen. Coyotes hunt the basin from end to end. They leave their tracks across every wash and arroyo for 50 miles, but there is a small meadow on the western flank of the peak, no bigger than a baseball field, where you will not find a single coyote print. Hunters have watched a pack run straight at the meadow and then split, like water around a stone, passing on either side. The deer do the same. The jackrabbits do the same. Even the ravens, who are not afraid of much, will not roost in the few twisted junipers that grow at the meadow's edge. A biologist came out in the 1960s to study the basin's mule deer. She kept careful notes. She wrote in a small, neat hand that the herd avoided the meadow even in drought, when the grass there was the greenest grass for miles. She had no theory. She only had the observation. The grass grew. The deer would not eat it. The meadow stayed full and untouched, like a table set for a guest who never arrived. Then the treasure hunters. The land has stories about them too. Men walked in with shovels on their shoulders, hats high, voices loud. Some came back days later with their hats in their hands, talking quieter. Some came back weeks later, thinner than they went in, faces burned, eyes set deep. A few came back smaller, in a way that had nothing to do with weight. Something in their posture had folded. They did not boast in the bars anymore. They did not draw maps on napkins. They paid their tabs and went home, and never spoke of the peak again. It might be the heat. It might be the disappointment of a hole that gave them nothing. Or it might be something the land does to a person who walks in expecting to take, and finds, instead, that the place is older and stranger than any claim he could file. The desert does not forget. It only waits for the next set of boots. There is a pattern in this country that shows up wherever gold is rumored to sleep beneath the soil. A man finds something, word travels. Then men in nice suits arrive, and a gate goes up, and the story turns soft at the edges, like a photograph left in the sun. You see it at Victorio Peak in the years after the war. Senators came down to the desert in dark cars with white sidewalls. Generals walked the dry washers with their boots polished and their hats squared. A man named Senator Joseph Montoya took an interest. So did the brass at White Sands. The fence around Hembrillo Basin grew taller. The signs grew sharper. The locks grew heavier. And the families who once camped near the peak found themselves turned back at a road they had driven for 40 years. That same pattern has played out in other corners of this country, in other decades, with different names painted on the gates. Up in the Superstition Mountains of Arizona, the Lost Dutchman mine has drawn the same kind of quiet visitors for more than a century. Ranchers tell of black sedans rolling up the dirt tracks in the 1950s, of survey crews with no patches on their uniforms, of helicopters that flew without numbers on their tails. The Forest Service drew new boundaries. The state drew new boundaries, and somewhere in the folds of those red rock peaks, a story that belongs to prospectors and old Mexican vaqueros now belongs to filing cabinets in offices far away. In the hills above Beale Street in California, the story repeats. Thomas Beale's coded papers spoke of a vault of gold and silver buried somewhere in Bedford County, Virginia. The locals dug for it for 100 years with shovels and prayers. Then, in the 1980s, men with surveying equipment arrived without warning. Land changed hands. New deeds appeared. The diggers were politely turned away by lawyers who spoke softly and carried thick folders. In the swamps of Louisiana, near a place called Jean Lafitte's old hideout, oil company men once leased a strip of ground for what the locals called pennies. They drilled no wells. They pumped no oil. They simply built a fence and posted guards in plain clothes and stayed for 11 years. When they left, the fence came down and the ground inside it had been disturbed in ways no drilling rig could explain. The pattern is always the same. A legend, a discovery, a pause. Then, the quiet arrival of important men with important reasons that nobody is allowed to question. The gate goes up. The story goes underground, just like the treasure it was built to guard. At Victorio Peak, this pattern wore the faces of real people you could look up in old newspapers. There was General John Jolly, who oversaw the missile range in the years when the Noss family was begging for access. There was Senator Clinton Anderson, who took meetings about the peak and then took no further action that anyone could find on paper. There was the visit, recorded in faded press accounts, of cars with government plates rolling out toward the basin, at hours when no official business should have been done. The Noss family told reporters that they saw trucks coming back down from the peak in the night. Loaded trucks, slow trucks, trucks that did not exist on any logbook they were ever allowed to see. Skeptics say it was only routine military traffic. Believers say a fortune left that mountain piece by piece, hauled away under the cover of testing schedules and security clearances. You will find no proof either way. That is the nature of the pattern. It exists in the spaces between documents, in the gaps where paper trails should be and somehow are not. Whole years of range logs from White Sands have gone missing from the archives. Memos referenced in other memos cannot be found themselves. Witnesses who spoke once and then fell silent, with no clear reason given for the silence. This is the shape of a certain kind of American story. The gold may be real or imagined. The chambers may be full or empty. But the gate is always real. The men in suits are always real. The road that used to be open and is now closed is always real. You can drive across this country and find a dozen places like Victorio Peak. Fences in the middle of nowhere. Roads that end at locked chains, mountains, where the maps go vague and the rangers grow polite and unhelpful. Each one keeps its own version of the same old whisper. Something is in there. Something was found. And somebody, somewhere, decided you would never be allowed to know what. Doc Noss did a foolish thing in the autumn of 1939, and the desert has not forgotten it. He wanted a wider passage. The shaft that led down into the chamber was narrow, choked in places, and hard on a man's back. Doc was not a patient man. He was a foot doctor with a treasure under his boots, and every trip down that hole took hours he felt he didn't have. So he hired a fellow named Montgomery, and Montgomery brought dynamite. The story goes that they set the charges too deep, or too many, or in the wrong seam of rock. The mountain answered with a long, low cough that rolled across Hembrillo Basin like distant thunder. When the dust settled, the way down was gone. Tons of pale limestone had folded in on themselves, sealing the path Doc had walked for 2 years. The bars he claimed to have stacked in the dark were now buried under 100 feet of broken stone. That should be where the story ends. A foolish man, a bad blast, a sealed cave, but the artifacts that came out before the collapse are what keep the story breathing. There is a photograph, faded to the color of weak tea, that shows Doc kneeling beside a long dark bar, set on a wooden crate. The bar is the length of a loaf of bread, scored along its edge, and far heavier than it looks. Doc is grinning the tight grin of a man trying not to grin. Behind him, propped against the wall of a small adobe shed, you can see the curve of what looks like an old Spanish helmet, the kind with the high comb down the middle. Nobody ever explained the helmet. It is just there in the corner of the picture, quiet as a question. There is a letter written in 1940 from Doc's wife Ova to her sister back in Oklahoma. The letter is mostly about chickens and weather, but near the bottom, in the same calm hand, she writes that the doctor is sad because the mountain has closed its mouth. She says, he brought up 16 bars before the blast and hid them in places only he knows. She says, one bar is sewn into the lining of an old saddle in the barn. The letter survives. The saddle does not. There is a cigar box, now kept by a family in Las Cruces, that holds 11 small discs of dull yellow metal. Each disc is stamped with a crude cross and a worn date that some readers see as 1762 and others see as nothing at all. The family says the discs came from their grandfather, who worked for Doc one summer, hauling water. They say Doc paid him in coins instead of dollars. A jeweler tested one in the 1980s and pronounced it gold, soft and high in purity, the kind you do not find in any modern mint. There is a length of leather strap, cracked and dark, that a rancher found wedged under a stone near the old shaft in 1952. The strap is stitched in a pattern nobody in the basin recognized. A scholar from El Paso later said the stitching matched the work of a religious order that operated in northern Mexico in the 1600s. The strap is now in a drawer in Santa Fe, labeled and unexplained. There are also things found where they should not have been. A small iron crucifix, green with age, turned up in a wash 3 miles from the peak after a hard rain in 1961. A pair of hand-forged nails, square and crude, came out of an arroyo in 1974, the kind of nails the Spanish brought north 400 years ago. Each piece, on its own, means nothing. The desert is full of old metal, but each piece points the same direction, like iron filings drawn toward a magnet under the sand. And then there is the rock itself. People who climbed down before the blast described the walls of the chamber as veined with something that caught the lamplight strangely. After the collapse, chunks of that wall came tumbling out among the debris. A few were carried home by curious hands. One sits on a mantle, in truth or consequences to this day, a fist-sized piece of limestone shot through with threads of pale gold that no geologist has been willing to call ordinary. You can hold these things, you can turn them in your fingers. They do not prove a chamber, they do not prove a fortune. They only prove that something strange was happening at Victorio Peak before Doc Noss lit his fuses and brought the sieving down on his own dream. Doc Noss died in 1949, shot dead near the foot of the mountain by a business partner who wanted what he believed was hidden inside. But the story did not die with him. It moved into kitchens and living rooms, into the soft hours after Thanksgiving dinner, into bedrooms where grandfathers leaned close and told grandchildren things they were not supposed to forget. The Noss family kept the story alive the way some families keep a Bible, page by page, name by name, passed hand to hand across the long table of years. Babe Noss, Doc's widow, became the keeper of the flame. She lived for decades after her husband fell, and she told the story to anyone who would sit still long enough to hear it. She told it to her children. She told it to her grandchildren. She told it to reporters with notebooks, and strangers with cameras, and lawyers with briefcases full of paper. Each telling sanded the edges a little smoother. Each telling carried the same bones underneath. The bones were these: a mountain in the desert, a hole that opened into a chapel of gold, a stack of bars taller than a man, a husband who had seen it with his own 2 eyes and had paid for that seeing with his life. Babe never wavered, not when the army locked the gate, not when the lawyers shrugged, not when the years thinned her voice to a whisper. Her son Harold grew up inside the story, like a boy grows up inside a house. He remembered his father's boots by the door, and his mother's hand on the kitchen table, and the maps spread out under the lamp at night. He remembered the way grown men spoke in low tones when they thought he was asleep. By the time Harold was old enough to drive, the mountain had become a kind of relative, talked about at every meal, blamed for every sorrow, blessed for every hope. Other families carried other versions. The descendants of Padre LaRue still told the story of the priest who hid the diggings before the soldiers came, and they told it in Spanish, with the small, careful words of people who believe a thing is holy. The descendants of the Apache scouts who had ridden the basin told their own versions, quieter, edged with warning. The descendants of the soldiers stationed at the range during the war years had stories of trucks moving at night and crates loaded under tarps, and officers who would not say where they had been. All of these families dreamed. That is the part the records cannot hold. Grandmothers dreamed of a cave full of saints with their faces turned to the wall. Uncles dreamed of mules walking in a line through dry grass, their packs heavy with something that caught the moon. Cousins woke up at 3 a.m, convinced the mountain had whispered a name they could not quite remember. The dreams pointed south. They always pointed south, toward the Hembrillo Basin, toward the long pale slope of Victorio Peak. By the 1970s, the story had moved into a second generation of believers, people who had never met Doc Noss, but who carried his name like a torch handed across a dark room. They formed clubs. They printed newsletters on cheap paper. They wrote letters to senators and congressmen and presidents, and sometimes the letters were answered with polite, empty words, and sometimes the letters were not answered at all. Each new generation polished the old details and quietly dropped the ones that no longer fit. The bars grew taller in the telling. The skeletons grew older. The chapel grew wider, and the gold grew brighter, and the army grew more guilty, and the priest grew more saintly. Some details fell away like dry leaves. The exact number of crosses Doc had counted, the exact shape of the chamber, the exact words his mother had spoken on the morning he first crawled down into the dark. Those things slipped through the family hands and were lost. But the core remained: a mountain, a door, a treasure, a man who saw it, and a widow who never stopped knocking. There are families in New Mexico today, grown children of grown children, who still drive out to the basin on certain weekends. They park at the fence. They look up at the peak. They tell their own children the story the way it was told to them, with the same long pauses in the same places, with the same low voice when they come to the part about the skeletons. The mountain stands there, the color of old bread, and it listens, and the dreams keep pointing south. Step back for a moment from the arguments. Set aside the men in suits and the men in mining boots. Forget, just for now, the senators and the soldiers and the lawyers with their thick paper folders. Underneath all that noise, there's a quieter story, a softer one, and it might be closer to the truth than any of the rest, because something happened at Victorio Peak, something real in the ordinary sense of the word. People went there. People came back changed. Whole families shaped their lives around what they thought lay inside that mountain. Children grew up hearing the same stories over breakfast. Old women kept rosaries in their dresser drawers and prayed for the souls of men who had walked into the dark and not come out the same. You don't build a town's memory on nothing. Pick up any thread of the legend and follow it back, and you find something tender at the core. A cave full of saints. That's what the old stories really say when you listen close. Not just bars of gold stacked like firewood, not just dust in cigar boxes. The deeper accounts speak of statues, wooden figures of the Virgin with paint flaking from their cheeks, small carved santos with hands worn smooth by centuries of prayer, silver crosses laid out on stone shelves like sleeping children. That detail matters. Gold alone is a treasure, but saints and crosses are something else entirely. They are devotion. They are the things people carry when they are running. They are what a priest grabs from a burning chapel before he grabs anything else. If even part of the legend is true, then somebody once hid more than wealth inside that mountain. Somebody hid their whole faith, their whole world, the bones of who they were. Think of the Spanish missions scattered across the Southwest in the 1600s and 1700s. Adobe walls, white as bone in the sun, bells of hammered bronze, altars stacked with handmade silver, beaten thin by craftsmen who learned the trade from their fathers. When trouble came, and trouble came often, those bells were taken down, those altars were broken apart and wrapped in oiled cloth. Mules were loaded in the dark, and the long walk into the hills began. Some of those hidden things were recovered, most were not. The desert kept them, the mountains kept them, and the people who hid them died with the secret folded under their tongues. That is the quieter truth at Victorio Peak. Not whether the gold was there, but that something was there worth hiding. Whether it was a Spanish treasury, or an Apache offering ground, or the strong box of a renegade priest, the mountain held something, and the people who lived in its shadow could feel it, the way you feel a candle burning in a room you have not yet entered. The town of Hatch knew. The ranchers of the Jornada del Muerto knew. The old families of Hot Springs, before they renamed the town Truth or Consequences, knew. They spoke about the peak the way you speak about a church, with a small lowering of the voice, with a glance that meant more than the words. Doc Noss, for all his troubles and all his tall tales, did not invent that reverence. He stepped into a current that was already running. He told one version of a story the country around him had been telling for 200 years. The shape of his story fit the shape of older stories, like a hand fits a glove worn soft by another hand before it. That is why the legend will not die. Even if you prove tomorrow that the chambers were empty, that every bar was hauled out before the army drew its fence, the story would survive. Because the story was never only about gold. It was about a place where the desert kept its faith, a place where the old world had folded itself away to wait. You can walk past Victorio Peak today and see nothing but a humpbacked rise of stone in a basin full of yucca and pale grass. The wind moves through it, the way wind moves through every empty place. But the people who grew up looking at that hill from their kitchen windows did not see an empty place. They saw a door. They saw a room behind the door. And inside the room, on a stone shelf in the cool dark, a wooden virgin with flaking paint stood waiting for someone to remember her name. Whatever else is true or untrue about Victorio Peak, that much is real. The mountain mattered. It still matters. And the silence around it is not the silence of nothing. It is the silence of something held back, on purpose, with care. Step away from the fire for a moment. Walk with me out past the last ring of light, out past the parked trucks, past the dry wash, where the sand still holds the heat of the day. Let your eyes adjust. The Caballo mountains rise to the east like the long back of a sleeping horse, and that is exactly what their name means. Horses, a line of them, dark against a darker sky. You are standing in the basin now. The ground under your boots is pale, almost silver in the starlight. Bits of quartz catch the light here and there, winking like small coins someone dropped 1,000 years ago. The brush is low and grey, creosote, mesquite, a little cholla cactus holding its arms up like a tired dancer. The air smells of dust and dry sage, and something faintly sweet, the way the desert smells after the sun finally lets go. Above you, the sky is the kind of sky most people never see anymore. The Milky Way runs across it like a river of milk poured from a tipped jar. You can see the dust lanes inside it. You can see stars stacked behind stars. Out here, with no town for 40 miles, the dark is so clean it feels washed. Listen, a coyote calls somewhere south, thin and high, like a question. Another answers from the foothills, closer than you'd guess, then quiet. The wind moves through the creosote with a soft, dry sound, like someone turning the pages of an old book. A bat ticks overhead, smaller than a thought, far off. A cow lows once and gives up. This is the country that holds the secret. Victorio Peak sits behind you, a dark hump against the western sky, separate from the Caballos but watching them. The whole basin between feels like a room with the lights turned off, a room with the door left open just a crack, somewhere under your feet. If the stories are true, there are passages, cold air sleeping in stone halls, pale dust on the floors, maybe a saddlebag rotted to lace, maybe a stack of bars wrapped in oiled cloth, maybe nothing at all but the slow drip of water and the bones of bats. The desert does not tell you which. The desert never tells you which. Sit down on a flat rock. Feel the warmth still leaking out of it from the long day. The stone is rough and gritty under your palm. A little black beetle wanders past your boot, going somewhere only it knows. You let it pass. The mountains do not look threatening from here. They look patient. They have been patient for a very long time. They watched the Apache ride through these passes on horses they painted with handprints. They watched Spanish friars walking south with rosaries clicking against their belts. They watched soldiers in blue wool sweating in the heat, and soldiers in olive drab driving jeeps, and treasure hunters with metal detectors and bad maps and big hopes. The mountains watched all of them come and watched all of them go. The wind shifts. It carries the smell of distant rain, even though no rain is falling. Somewhere over the San Andres, lightning flickers once, soft as a heartbeat, too far away for thunder. The flash lights the western ridge for a single second, and you see it clear every fold and gully, and then it's gone, and the dark folds back over the land like a blanket. You feel small here, not in a bad way. Small, the way a child feels small in a great cathedral, when the ceiling is so high it makes you forget your own worries. Small the way a single grain of sand feels in a riverbed. The basin holds you the way a cupped hand holds water, gently, without grip. The stars wheel slow above you. Orion is climbing. The Pleiades sit like a little smudge of silver dust off to one side. A satellite crosses, steady as a thought, then disappears behind the shoulder of the mountain. Somewhere in the rocks, an owl calls, low and round, the sound of a finger blown across the lip of a bottle. If there is gold down there, it is sleeping. If there is no gold down there, the silence is just as deep. Either way, the desert holds it the same. The Caballos do not care which it is. Their door, if there is a door, stays quiet tonight. Lie back. Let the rock take your weight. Let the sky take your eyes. You are very small, and the night is very wide, and the secret is very patient. There is no hurry. There has never been any hurry here. Down in hatch and truthful consequences in the little towns that ring the San Andres like beads on a string. The story of Victorio Peak settled into the bones of the place. It became weather. It became something you knew before you knew how you knew it. Children grew up hearing it the way other children hear about Paul Bunyan or Johnny Appleseed. By the time they were old enough to ride out into the basin themselves, they already had the map of it folded inside their heads. The old-timers used to gather at a feed store in Hatch on Saturday mornings. They drank black coffee from paper cups and argued about gold the way other men argue about baseball. One of them was a rancher everyone called Old Pete. He had a face like a dry creek bed and a soft voice that made you lean in. Pete swore that as a boy, back in the late 1920s, he had ridden with his grandfather to the edge of the Hembrello Basin and seen stones that glowed at night. The way Pete told it, the stones sat in a low ring near the base of the peak. They looked plain by daylight, grey and dusty, no different from 100 other rocks. But when the moon came up full and white, they took on a soft inner light, like coals that had cooled past red into something gentler. His grandfather said the old Spanish miners had set them there as markers. Pete believed it until the day he died, whether the stones were real or just a trick of moonlight on quartz. The story of them spread. Folks in town started leaving offerings out on their windowsills. Little pinches of gold dust or fool's gold, hoping the mountain might notice. A bakery in Truth or Consequences began selling sugar cookies cut in the shape of mountains, dusted with edible gold flakes. They called them peat stones, and they sold out every Saturday. Each spring, the little town of Hatch held a parade for chili peppers, since chili was what truly paid the bills. But somewhere in the middle of the parade, by tradition, a single old pickup truck rolled through, carrying a man dressed as a conquistador. He wore a tin breastplate and waved at the children. Behind him came a burro loaded with painted rocks, and the children would chase the burro down the street, trying to catch the rocks before they fell. Nobody outside Hatch understood the float. Nobody inside Hatch needed it explained. A school teacher named Mrs. Aragon used to take her 5th graders out to the foothills once a year, to a safe spot well away from the military fences. She taught them how to read the land. She showed them the patterns of chola and creosote, the way the dry washes ran south after a rain, the soft pink of the cliffs at sunset. Then she told them the story of the peak. She always ended the same way. The gold is not the lesson, she would say. The mountain is the lesson. The high school football team in a nearby town took the name the Prospectors. Their mascot wore a fake beard and carried a plastic pickaxe. The marching band played a slow brass tune at halftime that everyone called the Gold Song, though nobody could remember who wrote it or when. A piano teacher in town claimed her father had composed it for a play about Padre LaRue back in 1952. The records were lost in a flood, and the song lived on by ear alone. Visitors came through, of course. They always did. Treasure hunters with metal detectors, writers with notebooks, television crews with shiny cameras, and impatient producers. The locals were friendly enough, but careful with their words. They had learned over the years that outsiders wanted the gold to be simple. A box, a door, a map with a clear X. The people of the basin knew better. The story was bigger than any single chamber. The story was the whole desert, and the wind, and the way the light fell on the peak at 5 in the afternoon. When old Pete passed, sometime in the early 1990s, his family scattered his ashes near the edge of the basin, as close to the restricted line as the law allowed. Somebody left one of his glowing stones on top of the small cairn they built. The stone sat there for years. Then one morning it was gone. No one ever claimed they took it. No one ever claimed they saw it leave. The desert had simply folded it back into itself, the way the desert had folded so many things, and the people who lived there only nodded when they heard. There's a story about a woman named Norma. She wasn't born in New Mexico. She grew up in a small wooden house in eastern Tennessee, where the hills roll green and the creeks run cold over flat stones. But her father had been one of the early diggers at Victorio Peak, back in the years after Doc Noss first crawled out of that hole. He brought home stories the way other men brought home river rocks. He carried them in his pockets. He set them on the kitchen table, and his daughter listened. Norma left Tennessee in her 20s. She moved to Indiana, then to Ohio, then to a small town outside Pittsburgh, where the steel mills still glowed orange against the night sky. She worked as a bookkeeper. She raised 2 children. She kept a single cigar box on the top shelf of her closet, and inside that box, she kept her father's notes, pencil drawings of tunnel mouths, a folded square of butcher paper with a crooked line that might have been a map, a small dull stone he swore had come from the chamber itself. In 1977, she got a letter. The envelope was thin and government white, and the return address read Albuquerque. The letter told her that the FBI had opened a file. They were gathering statements from anyone connected to the old Nos claim. They wanted to know what her father had seen, what he had taken, what he had told her before he died. Norma sat at her kitchen table in Pennsylvania, 3 states removed from the desert, and she read that letter 4 times. She wrote back. She told them what she could. She told them about the bars stacked like firewood, about the skeletons, about the rope her father had tied around his waist before he went down. She mailed the letter and waited. Months passed, then years. The reply, when it came, was short and polite, and said almost nothing. But the story had moved with her. That was the thing. The legend had crossed the Mississippi, climbed the Appalachians, and settled into a small brick house in a town where nobody had ever seen a yucca or smelled the dry sweetness of creosote after rain. She told her grandchildren about Victorio Peak the way other grandmothers told fairy tales. She described the mountain to them, the pale rock, the color of old bone, the thin trails that looped up the slopes like loose thread, the hawks that turned slow circles in the blue. She had never been there herself. She had only her father's words, and her father had been gone a long time, but she described it so well that her grandchildren believed she had walked those hills. They believed she had stood at the mouth of the tunnel and smelled the cold air rising from below. The FBI box that came up in 1977 became a piece of family legend on its own. Norma believed the government had taken something. She believed that somewhere in a federal warehouse, in a beige cardboard box with a number written on the side, sat the papers her father had filed and the small stone samples he had handed over for testing. She believed those things had been quietly filed away and forgotten, or quietly filed away and remembered by the wrong people. Others have said the box held very little. A few photographs, a handful of statements, some maps drawn by men who had never been underground. They say the federal investigation was a polite gesture, a way of closing a door that had been rattling for 40 years. They say there was no gold in the box because there had never been any gold to put there. Norma died in the late 90s. Her cigar box passed to her oldest granddaughter, who lives now in Oregon, in a town where the rain falls soft on cedar shingles. The granddaughter has never been to New Mexico either, but she keeps the box on a shelf above her desk, and sometimes she opens it and unfolds the butcher paper map, and she traces the crooked line with one finger. This is how the legend travels, not in books, not in news reports, in cigar boxes carried across state lines, in stories whispered to sleepy children, in pencil drawings folded and unfolded until the crease is where it is. The chamber, if it exists, stays where it is, but the story moves. It rides in glove compartments. It settles in attics in Pennsylvania and closets in Oregon. It waits, quiet as a stone, for someone to open the box and look inside. His name was Terry DeLernus, and for a long stretch of years, near the end of the 20th century, he was the last man in America who said he had stood at the door of the chamber. Terry was not a wild-eyed prospector. He was a thoughtful man, soft-spoken, raised in a family that had carried the story like an old quilt passed from grandmother to grandchild. He was the great-nephew of Doc Nos, the country doctor who first crawled into the dark beneath Victorio Peak back in 1937. Terry grew up hearing the tale at kitchen tables in California, the way other children hear stories about Santa Claus or Christmas mornings long gone. He did not believe it because he had to. He believed it because the people he loved had never stopped believing. In the late 1980s, Terry put on a suit and walked into government offices and did something his family had never quite managed. He spoke softly. He hired lawyers. He brought maps and old photographs and yellowed letters. And after years of careful work, the United States Army opened the locked gate. They called the project Gold Finder. Picture the desert at dawn in those days. The Caballo and San Andres mountains, glowing pale rose, the basin still cold from the night. Picture trucks rolling slowly through the brush, kicking up little ribbons of dust. Picture men in hard hats walking up the slope of Victorio Peak with surveying gear and ground-penetrating radar, a kind of tools Doc Noss could never have dreamed of. Picture Terry Delonis at the front, quiet, watching the mountain his family had chased for half a century. They worked for months. They dug. They scanned. They lowered cameras into cracks and pumped water out of flooded passages. They cleared rock that had fallen long ago, when somebody, sometime, had touched off dynamite in the dark and brought the ceiling down. They followed shafts that bent and twisted like the burrows of some great sleeping animal. And here is where the story breaks open into wonder. They found things. They found old timbers. They found bits of leather. They found voids in the rock where the radar said there should be empty space, chambers waiting just beyond the reach of their tools. They found tunnels that ended in walls of fallen stone, and behind those walls the instruments hummed and pinged in ways that suggested more rooms, more passages, more silence kept by the mountain. They did not find the gold, or so the official record reads. The expedition ended, the gate closed again, the army took back its land, and the desert took back its quiet. Terry Delonis went home, older, thinner, his savings spent, his family's long hope folded up like a map nobody quite knew how to read. But here is the thing he said near the end. He said the chamber was still there. He said they had been close. He said the mountain had not given it up, not because the gold was gone, but because the door had moved. Cave-ins, floods, 100 years of shifting stone. The room Doc Noss had described, with its stacked bars and its bones and its trickle of cold water, was somewhere just beyond where the lights had reached. Some who watched the work agreed with him. They said the radar readings were strange enough, the voids real enough, the old tunnels promising enough that another season, another summer, another careful dig might have changed everything. Others shook their heads. They said if there had been gold, the searchers would have found it. They said the dream was just a dream, kept alive by love and by stubborn memory. Both sides walked away from the same mountain. Both sides told the same story in opposite directions. And so the question hangs in the dry New Mexico air, the way a hawk hangs on a thermal. Not falling, not flying, just there. If Terry Delonis was right, the chamber still waits under Victorio Peak, sealed by rock and luck and the patience of the desert. If he was wrong, then a family spent 4 generations chasing a beautiful shape made of nothing but lantern light and longing. There is no third answer. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The mountain sits where it has always sat, low and brown against the wide pale sky. The wind moves through the creosote bushes. The shadows of clouds slide across the slope like dark hands feeling for a doorknob. And somewhere beneath all that quiet stone, either everything is there or nothing is, and the desert is in no hurry at all to tell you which. So here we are, you and I, at the end of a long road that never really ends. The fire has burned low. The coals glow soft and orange, like little eyes that have grown sleepy from watching the dark. Out beyond the porch, the desert stretches flat and silver under the moon. The Caballo mountains rest on the horizon like sleeping animals, their long backs rising and falling against a sky thick with stars. Victorio Peak is out there too. You cannot see it from here, but you can feel it. A small hill in a wide basin, holding its breath. The wind moves over its slopes the way it has moved for 10,000 years. Soft, patient, sweeping fine pale dust into the cracks where men once knelt, with lanterns and hammers, and dreams too big to carry home. We have heard a lot of voices tonight. We heard about Doc Noss falling through a hole in 1937 and climbing back up with bars of yellow metal in his pockets. We heard about Padre LaRue and his mountain of secrets. We heard about Spanish mules that never came home, and Apache stories of caves where cold light glowed against the walls. We heard about the Cavalry patrol that rode into the basin and rode out of history. We heard about senators and generals, widows and dreamers, dynamite and dust. And still, after all of it, the question sits quietly between us. Is the gold real? Was it ever there? And if it was, who carried it away in the long dark hours when no one was looking? Maybe the chamber is still down there, sealed behind 1,000 tons of fallen stone. Maybe the bars sit